Hello everyone, today we talk about the Bamberger Reiter. If you have visited Bamberg, which is a marvelous town in and of itself, a little jewel, you have surely fallen in love with one of the greatest works of art in medieval history, the Bamberger Reiter, the horseman of Bamberg, a monumental equestrian statue carved from Schilf-Sandstein blocks and prominently displayed, in fact, in the Bamberg Cathedral, standing as one of the most enigmatic as well as artistically significant works of particularly the early 13th century, embodying the pinnacle of medieval sculptural artistry, at least by some standards, as well as a rich tapestry of historical, cultural, and religious symbolism. Today's video, in fact, is not just about, history of art per se. It is primarily traditional, archetypal history video. Also a Hohenstaufen history one about Frederick II and the Holy Roman Imperial ideal expressed by this masterpiece. That, by the way, is not an isolated piece, meaning that, of course, the Bamberger Reiter is unique as he gets. However, there is all across Europe, in particular within the Holy Roman Empire, and it's not, just some random location in these generations, equestrian statues that we'll surely cover in other videos. As a continuation of this one, as a matter of fact, we're talking the Magdeburger Reiter, for example, the Milanese statue of Oldrado da Treseno, St. Martin at Lucca. So there is really a flourishing of this symbolism in this early 13th century, very much connected with the imperial Ghibelline ideology and a renewed attitude towards the universe, the providential accessibility of heaven, and the ideal of the molding of the world in your own image. There were naturally in the history of Europe many precedents to this. If you think about Marcus Aurelius, the Pompey-Alexander mosaic at the Battle of Gaugamela, that surely informed the meaning of knighthood, of chivalry, and the broader sort of ecumenic dimension of conquest and world domination that you find in the Bamberger Reiter. But what makes the latter unique, and especially this is very historically meaningful as the renewal of mankind at the peak of the great medieval civilization and of Holy Roman imperial power. To some extent, we debated on whether, in particular, Frederick Barbarossa's power was greater than the one of his grandson, Frederick II. Indeed, say in relative terms, Frederick I's reign was the most important. We've seen this celebrated as Frederick is the model of the emperor, incarnating Charlemagne himself as much as also Otto I, and of course Frederick II literally doubled down on the Kaiser Friedrich, as we've seen again in the videos about the slumbering monarch of the German folklore that was, as we've seen also in the video about, for example, Saint-Denis in France. They're literally like the mausoleum of the Western Frankish kings, literally believed as a universal concept across all of Europe. Well, the various mounts of Jupiter, hence also the mounts of where the emperor resided. About the same Frederick II, as you know, there are many legions, including him riding with his retinue into the Etna mouth and more, the concept of the return in the end time and so on. But the Bamberger Reiter also embodies that reaffirmation, let's say, of imperial, virile, and Apollonian confidence from the sort of darker eras of the Middle Ages, when imperial, royal, public authority had waned, and at this point was reconcretizing with a completely different attitude towards creation, right? This is, we'll see now, there are some very interesting artistical concepts behind this. Germany had emerged a bit later compared to Western Europe in terms of open sort of confidence, in terms of world domination, regardless of the fact that it had already, in fact, secured the Sacrum Romanum Imperium from, in fact, high medieval times, saying Charlemagne. However, again, we also talk about the two franchises, so to say, in the West and in the East. What was the deal in terms of actual civilizational development and also power? And Germany stands out, especially at the beginning of the 13th century, with Frederick II de facto ruling over Italy, Germany, Sicily, Burgundy, etc., even Jerusalem, as truly the most universal of the medieval sovereigns, the one that, also from an ideological point of view, the Bamberger Reiter, being a consequence of the same, had truly given hope that the new golden age could be reaffirmed in Latin Christendom in order for it to dominate, through, in fact, the Holy Roman Emperor, the world entire. We never really delved too much into this topic, also because Frederick II is one of the single most debated and still yet to be fully explored, researched, understood historical figures in the picture. I will not digress in this video specifically about what we know about him, we could think about him, because it's just one of those figures you can't quite frame unless you have properly studied him for decades and decades. Naturally, I have lots of videos about him, but I still feel it's Schwerpunkt to be at the beginning. The Bamberger Reiter surely helps understanding Frederick's idea and of fate, of power, of mysticism. Positioned on the console at the north pillar of the Georgenchor, the Bamberger Reiter's original placement, confirmed by meticulous research in 2004, has remained unchanged since its creation, suggesting a deliberate and meaningful spatial relationship with the cathedral's doppelgrab of Emperor Heinrich II and Kunigunde, as well as its proximity to the Fürstenportal, the ceremonial entrance associated with imperial and liturgical processions. All right, so there is pandan with the double burial of the imperial couple Henry II. We talked about him not in a dedicated video, but in Ottonian history we obviously took our time to discuss him. And of course there is a broader function this church has had, especially, you can say just especially in Germany, but because of the empire indeed, and the more archaic and primitive, but in a positive sense really, view of the Sacrum Romanum Imperium, the participation of imperial authority to ecclesiastical affairs, especially after Worms, the ecclesiastical princes had been heavily sort of feudalized in a almost privatistic sense, loads even more the meaning of this work of art that had obviously to celebrate this connubium as well as the totality, in fact, of universal power. Likely crafted between 1225 and 1237, so we are in some of the most important years of Frederick II's reign, also the heyday of Frederick II's splendor and rule, marked by consolidation of power in Sicily and initial engagement with the Holy Roman Empire, before also, in fact, his son's rebellion in Germany and deposition in Germany. Also before the cathedral's consecration, but after the significant political and cultural developments of the Staufer era. The statue thus encapsulates a sophisticated interplay of imperial ideology, Christian theology, and equestrian iconography that obviously all overlap. If you're interested in the equestrian symbolism, also St. George, dragon, etc., this is slightly different, but it all dates back to root made a video about probably the rise of this equestrian iconography in Europe in the 3rd century BC. And from there, you can argue that this is what the outcome was. The Bamberger Reiter precise identity, by the way, because there was an intense scholarly debate about this, remains, in fact, subject to opinion, with interpretations ranging from historical figures to symbolic representations. Obviously, it's both at the same time, but was this writer inspired to a very specific person, also of the past? This, again, would have also overlapped in at many symbolical level in any case, but the ventail, so to say, of options is quite fascinating, because each one is grounded in the complex social, political, and religious context of the time. The statue depicts a crowned, unarmed rider astride a horse, exuding an aura of serene authority in regal composure. Right? This is key to it, because it's not like military symbolism wasn't important. This was separated from the same, but the idea of a truly divine leader that doesn't even need to unsheath his sword or even bear one to be obeyed, right, is the absolute providential symbol. So already by this we understand we're on very high ground. The rider's posture is relaxed yet dignified, right? He doesn't need, he's a bit like the unmoved mover. This will develop, as you know, even more with at least the most typical Thomistic description later time, but it was already in fact a thing. Like there is this idea of no emotion, no perturbation, no becoming, right? This simply is. It's the being per se. The rider's left hand lightly holds the reins, guiding the horse with subtle control. The horse, of course, corresponds to obedience, regardless of its supporting role of a tamed force of nature, while the rider's right hand casually hooks into the tassel band of his mantle, a gesture deeply rooted in the courtly visual language of the period, signifying high status, self-assuredness, and a deliberate rejection of martial aggression. Right? If you are aware of Frederick II's accomplishments with Jerusalem, you know what there also the meaning could really be, especially after 1228, 1229, when he managed to grant access and control to the empire and Christians to Jerusalem once again from the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, which also triggered the papacy a bit, because this was a pact with the infidels rather than a glorious conquest in arms of the same city that in fact also later will be lost. By the way, the result of the Khwarezmian episode, we'll talk about that more. Besides, regardless this idea of peace, Frederick, as all Germanic names, is a military name, and in fact speaks of the Frede, that is the peace in arms of the Germanic people. Etymologically, think about the Landfried, think about the general, again, providential idea that, yeah, this is an order, a bit like the Pax Romana itself, but maintained by the virtue of the chosen people that has conquered the world, right? Reich stands for Reich, so the idea properly of an empire that does not need, again, to unseat this word to be obeyed, because it is the Holy Ghost itself, and therefore is capable through sheer will to power to have the entire world obeying, right? There's a deep propagandistic meaning in Frederick's reign, especially in these years. The horse, identified through advanced technological analysis in 2001 as a Schimmel, that is a white or gray horse, possibly an Apfel or Grau Schimmel, in fact, stands in composed, almost motionless pose, with its head slightly forward and one hind leg gently bent, evoking a state of poised readiness or repose. That is to say, we stand here, right? We rule the world from here. This distinctive stance, termed the Bamberger Standmotiv, sharply contrasts with the dynamic, forward-charging equestrian statues of antiquity, such as the Marcus Aurelius in Rome, or the more martial representations like the aforementioned Magdeburger Reiter, which emphasize movement and conquest in a more straightforward fashion, right? There is, again, a deep metaphysical understanding of this. Marcus Aurelius, again, we should analyze the statues better to understand that the core principle is there anyway, all right? But what indeed the Bamberger Reiter strikes you for is this expression of serenity, right? Of dignified order and nobiliar soul. The Bamberger horse is a Pelfroy, or Zelter, that is to say a light, elegant riding horse used for courtly processions and diplomatic occasions, rather than a heavy war horse like the Dextrarius, the Ross, or a utilitarian workhorse such as the Roncinus, of course, underscoring the statue's association again with peace, nobility, and ceremonial splendor, aligning it with the ideals of chivalric and imperial decorum. Remember that at this point in history, feudal civilization is at its peak, all right, of military power, political order, technical capacity. And we're in Germany, by the way, that is a very heavily feudal country, especially at this point, especially since the reign of Frederick I. And such institutional order is the one that the Hohenstaufen, in particular in Germany, affirm, also in this visual style, in order to legitimize their own rule at the top of it. The original vibrant polychromy of the statue, this was all color, this was really typical of the eras of antiquity, now largely faded, unfortunately, due to the centuries of exposure, of course, significantly enhanced its visual impact with the cathedral's sacred space. It had to appear as living, right? Gothic art reinforced this as in a frame of heaven, of heavenly light. That's probably the architectural principle of Gothic, that the walls of the church are not made of stone, but of light itself, and the structure, so linear and elegant, is almost invisible in this sea of light, aiming at naturally illuminating also colored statues inside of the church. Historical records and trace analysis reveal that the base of the statue was painted green, obviously symbolizing the earth or a Verdant foundation, which is very much connected with recent videos at this point. Just yesterday made a video about the Tria Prima in the Hermetic triad structure, where the earth is the basis for any elevation toward divinity. We also seen in Virgil's work how the Indo-European concept of heaven is revealed through the transfiguration properly of the same land, of the same earth, with golden harvest and golden and purple sheep, the same color of the probably of the empire. Thus, this is a verdant, properly prosper land that naturally is illuminated by the Friede of the Saint Friedrich. The horse was white with brown spots, evoking the prized Schimmel breed. That's also why we know the type. The rider's clothing was a striking red, adorned with silver and gold stars, so basically the purple, right, reflecting celestial and imperial connotations. His boots were brown, and his crown, spurs, and belt were gilded, emphasizing his exalted status. The rider's dark hair, suggested by remaining pigment traces, has fueled scholarly debates about his identity, as hair color might align with specific historical figures. Notably, the horse's hooves are shod with horseshoes, one of the earliest sculptural depictions of this technological advancement in medieval equestrian culture, signaling the period's growing sophistication in equine management. As you know, Frederick II was very fond of this. His Sicilian court prospered in terms of zootechnical treatises. Think about the same, De Ars Verandicum Avibus, and more. Beneath the horse's front hooves, a sculptural representation of a green man, also very famous in medieval art, described by the art historian Kathleen Basford as the rider's, quote, dark counterpart, so the chthonic element at the basis, under the basis, introduces a layer of symbolic complexity. This figure, possibly evoking the pagan Sylvanus or a demonic force, in any case, contrasts with the rider's divine or imperial authority, suggesting a dialogue between the natural earthly realm and the spiritual or political order, a duality central naturally to medieval Christian thought. The reason why I say pagan, it's exactly because that's what this Sylvanus in particular represents, the fractal netherworld of the rustics and of the fourth estate that does not contemplate the unity of the imperial Catholic tradition. And that yet it must be at the basis of the world, because without that element, as you know, full divinity cannot be achieved. And the providential mission of the sovereign is exactly to transfigure the same. Besides, there is a German touch to this all, because as we were explaining before, Germany had just and over a very long time and with difficulty exited her historical forests, swamps, reconfigured herself as a fully civilized nation with clear and bona fide lands during the Ostsiedlung, expanding just as the Holy Roman Empire. At this point, you can notice, in fact, the much more Apollonian English and French Gothic. Germany had lingered a bit more into the Romanesque and had literally this forest symbolism emerging from the same sacred architecture. Was part, obviously, of the same Gothic idea of the monster outside. That is, however, as an error, still apparent error, still something that the whole universal structure of the cathedral requires in creation for, in fact, just at a surface level, to provide with an example of something that must be understood in the deeper and bigger picture, right? And that would have, in that sense, struck mostly the lower estates that were more terrified by these figures, but that, a knight would have simply laughed off, right? The Bamberger Reiter's iconography and strategic placement within the cathedral invite a multitude of interpretations, each deeply rooted in the historical, cultural, and religious milieu of the Staufer era. One compelling hypothesis identifies the rider as the same Emperor Friedrich II, who reigned between 1212 and 1250 as German king, and between 1220 and 1250 as Holy Roman Emperor, whose reign coincided with the statue's creation and whose profound engagement with equestrian culture and imperial ideology makes him naturally a strong candidate. He was a red-haired, the darker compared to the blonde may be a reason why this knight was represented like that, but it's not really clearly understood. Frederick's court, heavily influenced by Norman and Arabic traditions in art and literature, placed immense value on horses and symbols of prestige, power, and diplomacy. Some of the finest breeds of horses were Berber. Think about William the Conqueror's mount. The Normans had naturally doubled down on sort of tougher, rougher breeds, pioneering as Western Franks the most, in fact, advanced, heavily armored shock mounted chargers. At some point, we will see also Frederick's own army to understand how he scored in the military development of the year that naturally was very high. His, as a feudal power, and mostly from his Sicilian background, was heavily feudal, but also very heavily power concentrated. Besides, German knights were starting to sort of approach, probably the same level of development of the French ones, in their own specific Teutonic, furious fashion. And throughout the 13th century, as we've seen also in videos about the Battle of Tagliacozzo, quite painful if the poor Frederick had known, really incarnated. Naturally, it's a different symbol from the one of the Reiter here that is lean, almost ethereal. Germany, however, was pioneering the development of plate armor in knightly panoply in fact, in Western Europe, and that's something must be kept in mind exactly to contrast with, say, for example, the German rebellious princes that would have tried to challenge the imperial authority. This is a motive that lived on during the same centuries, also in the rise of the Habsburgs, right? This story of the Eucharist that is carried by Rudolf's horse that he decides not to ride anymore because he had brought his own lord on it. And so here you see it's always the horse. Besides, consider that Germany had maintained very, again, archaic traditions. On 13th century Central European battlefields, you could have still seen dracones standards. As we've seen in different videos, Otto IV of Brunswick, whose demise after the Battle of Bouvines allowed for, in fact, the full affirmation of Frederick as Holy Roman Emperor, had brought in the aforementioned battle, in fact, the symbol of a dragon that naturally is part of all the Catholic tradition as much as it has to be owned and conquered, as we explained also in the recent video about the Order of the Dragon of the 15th century. So a world incredibly rich in lived symbolism, not mere sort of figurative ideas, and that's why it's so painful to realize that we don't know too much about the Bamberger Reiter's history, if not on the backdrop of this overall context. Frederick's own meticulous oversight of equine breeding, care, and use is well documented in the Melfi Constitutions of 1231, which outlined detailed regulations for the management of imperial stables, among sort of the bigger statal picture. And in the veterinary treatise Hippiatria by Jordanus Rufus, composed under Friedrich's patronage around 1250-1256 in the Kingdom of Sicily. This text describes the ideal horse's physical attributes, such as a slender neck, dry head, small ears, and proportionate limbs that closely mirror the refined form of the Bamberger horse, suggesting a direct connection to the aesthetic and practical standards of the imperial court, so as a sort of parade horse more than else, incarnating this highly spiritual qualities, as opposed to, again, the massive muscular war horses, stallions smashing to anything on a battlefield. It's a bit like in the same Germanic mythology, the contrast between the Asen and the Wannen. The idea that the Indo-European hero is actually smaller than this titanic, barbarian, dumb figures. Same thing that the Romans thought about themselves compared to the Germans back in the day. And this is all blended in the Holy Roman Imperial continuation of the great Catholic tradition. Friedrich's personal anecdotes, such as his ownership of a legendary horse named Draco, by the way, which, as we've seen, is not really strange, and this gifted by Sultan al-Kamil, even less strange given that it was an infidel's gift that had to contrast with, in fact, the Apollonian purity of the heavenly Christendom during the 1228-1229 crusade, and his court's fascination with Alexander romances glorifying Bucephalus further tie the Bamberger Reiter to Frederick's persona, blending historical reality with mythic grandeur. Right, these were the great models of the time, especially Bucephalus as a black horse, right? So the chthonic element of the chariot, not the white one, like in fact the Bamberger one. So a horse that must be transfigured from literally a monstrous, strong, fire-spitting beast into a heavenly horse by his own rider that fully dominates and tames it. Alexander was really the actual standard of medieval knighthood, right? It wasn't much about, even the Romans or simply about the Germanic tradition. Alexander was the greatest champion of the chivalric romance, and also for obvious reasons. Frederick II's reign was characterized, as you know, and we've made already some videos about this, but about his majesty, the struggle with the papacy, the greater sense of sort of Ghibelline tradition, sophisticated propaganda campaign emphasizing peace, justice, and imperial ubiquity, right? Particularly during Frederick's, quote, peaceful crusade, which culminated in his self-coronation as King of Jerusalem. The ubiquity is all very important. Peace, justice, these are obvious. Like, peace manifests itself as long as properly a just ruler. Justice is the first objective of a ruler, and in particular on earth. Just look at also the recent video that I made, in fact, on the Indo-European concept of order as consciousness, and what in a Germanic mentality Midgard really was, like properly the age of justice, the age of order. This is something that already, like, the Germans also had in common with the Romans. From quite a while I made a video about that as well, right? But this is truly what the Germans still understand as a living within an elective monarchy, in terms of, like, we as freemen choose this leader because of this supernatural power that immediately manifests, absolutely manifests, and that therefore does not need to impose himself, but simply to open everybody's eyes. And imperial ubiquity metaphysically stems from this very concept that the emperor is everywhere. It's properly a divine spirit, and as such, he's capable of manifesting everywhere through sheer power and deterrence in a completely pacified world. This is also what Frederick was naturally putting forth as his own propaganda in an otherwise very sort of violent and brutal reign, characterized by a lot of wars that, in this sense, showed cracks, like in this idea of absolute imperial authority. As you know, think about the Archimedes, this prophecies that really saw from the other side in Frederick, Satan himself. All right. The Bamberger Reiter's unarmed, serene demeanor and the choice of palfrey traditionally associated with peaceful processions in medieval chivalric literature resonate with this image of a Friedensfürst, a prince of peace, right? Prince, princeps, first actually come from all the same root. And so a ruler that was able to lord uncontrasted over the world. The rider's gesture, with his hand resting on a tassel band rather than wielding a sword or lance, mirrors the virtues of humility and clemency, mansuetudo, clemencia, emphasized in Frederick's diplomatic rhetoric, as seen in the arenage of his chancery documents. The rider's intense, far-reaching gaze, described as a circumspectio or oculum providentiae, aligns with Friedrich's concept of imperial omnipresence articulated in the St. Memphis constitutions as the emperor's all-seeing oversight of his realm. In fact, he is relaxed, he's looking, however, the direction his eyes is caught, either in a sort of physical or better metaphysical sense, as he also looks at the world with a renewed confidence, right? With this need also not really using weapons, but simply directing his gaze wherever, that will be blessed by. The green man at the statue's base, possibly evoking a vigilant Sylvanus-like figure that in this sense may be possessed by the same higher order, complements this imagery. And so, warning also the lower estates in that sense, resonating with the poetic descriptions of Friedrich's all-seeing and all-hearing presence by court poet Reinmar von Zweite. Right? The symbolic layering positions the statue as a visual manifesto of Staufer imperial ideology, blending secular authority with divine sanction. The statue's location within the cathedral near the double grave of Henry II in Kunigunde reinforces its connection to the Hohenstaufen dynasty's imperial legacy. Right? This was, after all, the Ottonian house that historically the Staufer themselves descended from, because, as you know, they were the last heirs to probably the Franconian blood, at least in imperial continuity, given that the first Frederick, Duke of Swabia, we're talking back in the 11th century, and the ancestor to the rest of the Hohenstaufen rulers, had married Agnes of Germany. That was the daughter of Henry IV, the Salian, that in this sense conferred greater legitimacy. At the end of the day, the Salian dynasty finished in male line, and the Salians themselves had Ottonian blood because they actually descended themselves from the House of Saxony. So there you have a blend, probably very possible, of legitimate imperial continuity under any feudal, biological, legal rule. The Ottonians had carried out properly the Renovatio Imperii. Bamberg, the same Bamberg, envisioned by Henry II at the time, we are, as you know, at the beginning of the 11th century, as a new Rome, was a significant center for Hohenstaufen patronage, and Frederick II's ties to the city were substantial. For example, he oversaw the transfer of his uncle Philip of Swabia's remains from Bamberg to Speyer in 1213. That was, as you know, another great imperial mausoleum established by Conrad II, the son, so there was a great continuity there too. I made a video about Philip of Swabia's rise to power, short reign, and assassination. Otto IV to control after that. He was actually not responsible for it. He was assassinated for just personal reasons. But this was probably a bloodshed to be avenged, and it had essentially severed the passage probably of Hohenstaufen rulers, because that had occurred after the death of Frederick's father, Henry VI. Premature one, that, by the way, was starting. Essentially, he was planning a campaign to conquer Constantinople, and this very few years before the Venetians and the French would do it during the Fourth Crusade. So the ambitions and capacity of the Hohenstaufen were something enormous, and we unfortunately missed some of the most glorious pages of history because of this biological accidents. In any case, Philip had been brutally killed, and Philip was the brother of Henry VI, the uncle of Saint Frederick II, the children of Frederick I, and this was a huge deal because also blood was really understood to be sacred, even more in Germany to an extent. And so Frederick II resettles everything after his rise to the throne, even before the Battle of Bouvines, as you see from the year. So it was an incredibly powerful affirmation of imperial legitimacy and continuity, right? Frederick's ties with Bamberg were also evident in the sovereign's contribution to the cathedral's rebuilding after a fire in 1185. Frederick really provided with a great financial support to the cathedral. Also, he maintained a close relationship with Bishop Egbert von Andechs-Meranien, who reigned as bishop from 1203 to 1237. We haven't made a video about Meranien yet, but again, I will put it on the list. Needless to say, Egbert was a staunch Hohenstaufen supporter. Egbert's patronage likely facilitated the Bamberger Reiter statue's creation, possibly during Frederick's second visit to Bamberg in 1235, a period marked by his consolidation of power following the painful deposition of his rebellious son Henry VII, which was also almost a biblical theme, right? The son rebelling to the father in the sense also as literally like the future hero and the future god that, however, goes against God, a bit like a Lucifer. You know, the dreadful fate of Henry VII that essentially threw himself off a cliff as he was being transported from a castle to another as prisoner in Calabria, apparently as an act of free will. And an investigation in his body in contemporary times actually revealed that he was suffering of leprosy. So an extreme act of liberty, right? In a sense, I have failed, God has punished me with this horrendous illness, has deprived me of any possibility to succeed my father, that has imposed on me all of this. I will at least choose the way to die. I mean, just imagine being Frederick in this circumstance. Now, the Bamberger Reiter statue's creation likely post 1231, but before 1237, which aligns exactly with this context of a Hohenstaufen dominance in Bamberg. This is a period when the cathedral was being transformed into a monument of imperial and ecclesiastical authority. By the way, I made a video about Franconia. If you're interested, there is some deeper, so it's a pretty wide region. And Bamberg was a very strategic city because it really connected different parts, basically almost all of Germany, right? Alternative interpretations propose other identities for the rider, because at least we assume that he was Frederick II. You know, we have to imagine properly the full imperial meaning of it all. And these other options offer unique insights in the statue's purpose. One significant theory identifies the rider as Saint Stephen I of Hungary, who reigned between 1001 and 1038. We'll make a video about him because it's really a very important figure of Central Europe. In fact, he had been canonized in 1083, and he had been closely tied to Bamberg through his marriage to Gisela, sister of the same Henry II. Right. Stephen's early liturgical veneration in Bamberg, coupled with the city's extensive land holdings in Hungary, supports this hypothesis. Medieval legends portray Stephen as gentle, pious ruler, and a specific tale of him riding into a church as at that point, in fact, a pagan, and familiar with Christian customs, resonates with the statue's equestrian motive and its placement near the portal of the princes, through which the rider symbolically enters to pay homage to Henry and Kunigund, as also Holy Roman emperors. This is very interesting because really St. Stephen's might as a Central European saint was all connected with the civilization of the Magyars after the defeats inflicted on them by the Ottonians. And so this ultimate providentially successful mission accomplished by imperial authorities to transform the barbarians into Christians. We've seen it just recently in the video about Theodosius. That was Roman imperial propaganda since ever, and it naturally served a very specific and extremely relevant universal pattern. The horse itself may serve as an ethnic symbol, linking the Magyars to their Hunnic predecessors, a common medieval association, by the way. So the idea of this people's mostly very much connected with the equestrian tradition, because you wonder what does properly an equestrian statue have to do with the church in this regard. Of course, there are many saints, just like we have seen recently with Saint Martin of Tours, who was literally an elite cataphract of the imperial guard of Julian, by the way, or the same St. George, etc. So all the symbols evidently overlap historically, but they may have had something to do with the specific tradition that the Bamberg Cathedral enjoyed since the times of the Salians. Scholars like Achim Ubel and Manfred Schuller endorse this view, right, that the Bamberger Reiter is St. Stephen, citing Egbert's familial ties to Hungary through the Andechs-Meranien dynasty and his asylum there after the 1208 murder of Philip of Swabia, which forced him to flee to Bamberg, that is closer to Hungarian protection. Another compelling candidate is the same Philip of Swabia, reigning between 1198 and 1208. Again, I have a video about his reign, so exactly these years. At some point we can make a video just about him. And whose tragic assassination in Bamberg adds a poignant dimension to the statue's potential meaning, namely victory over death as a martyr of the empire for naturally the best possible fashion, and also probably ushering in the age of Frederick II. As we've seen in the video about Saint Denis, these cathedrals as resting places of monarchs were truly intended as mountains, right? As spiritual mountains like the Olympus, where in fact these rulers were simply slumbering because they were not really dead and their firmament soul was still in fact interfering with earth in this heavenly fashion and vivifying the power and the splendor of these very places. Remember the green grass, the green bases of the statue, awaiting for the awakening for the end time battle. Initially buried near the statue's current site, in fact, Philip's remains were later, as we said, transferred to Speyer by Frederick in 1213. The statue could serve as a memorial to this uncrowned king whose name meaning lover of horses, Philip. I just recently made a video about Philip of France, which was the guy thanks to whom the name of Philip spread in the West, because it had remained essentially an Hellenic thing since Macedonian times. In fact, the Philip in question would be Philip II, right, the father of the same Alexander III, right, so with an enormous meaning for the Hohenstaufen dynasty. The mother of Philip of Western Franks, Anne of Kiev, had decided probably to content the Western Franks that were naturally, as we were saying before, pioneering the strongest cavalry in Europe to have probably this enormous, in fact, Basileus, Sebastocratic meaning, right, from that enormous Catholic tradition that the Macedonian one brought, in fact, to the conquest of the world for. So this would make everything much of a bigger deal, and a peaceful disposition aligning with such iconography, however replete with this enormous military cult. The rider's unarmed state and the statue's position between the Fürstenportal also evoke the Advent liturgy of Psalm 24 with its imagery of the King of Glory entering the gates. And the imperial tomb reinforced this interpretation, presenting Philip as a virtuous ruler whose untimely death denied him the imperial crown. The statue's serene elegance may thus commemorate his legacy, with the Hohenstaufen narrative serving as a poignant reminder of the dynasty's triumphs and tragedies, like in the best Germanic sagas. A more symbolic reading, advanced by Hannes Möhring, posits the rider as a representation of the Messiah himself. From the Book of Revelation, 19:11-16, a crowned, unarmed figure riding a white horse destined to triumph through divine word rather than earthly weapons. Naturally, again, all this symbolism overlap in the Bamberger Reiter. There is no doubt that he is a bit of Frederick II, a bit of Philip of Swabia, a bit of God himself, a bit maybe even of Saint Stephen. The latter, say the Revelation's apocalyptic interpretation situates the statue within the eschatological fervor of the 13th century as well. That, as we've seen, was very alive, also against the Saint Frederick from the other side, from his opponent's side, but also was all one, say, during the Crusades. I mean, Jerusalem had fallen from the 80s of the previous century. As you know, down the line at the end of the 13th century, we also made a video about the siege of Acre, that the last major crusader avant-post in the Holy Land that fell. And so that was this idea of this enormous Egyptian power that was to overwhelm through Islamic force the remainders of the holders of the sacred citadels of the Holy Land. So a very, literally Asgard, like properly crepuscle of the twilight of the gods, and that Frederick was the last hope for, right? This was particularly true for the monastic military orders, that without Frederick really would have been nothing. And at this point, Bamberg's role as a spiritual center anticipated the heavenly Jerusalem in a sense. Frederick was very interested in this area because it was a sort of, as we've seen, Umphalen, a center of Germany in a broader political and geographical sense. It was replete with ecclesiastical tradition, history, and excellence. So it served really great purpose, close to Bohemia, to southeast Germany, that the same Hohenstaufen were trying to hegemonize, and properly opening way also to Thuringia, that was historically siding with the Hohenstaufen. Right, there's also there the history of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, as a matter of fact, that had died. There's all then Wagner made a story later of the Tannhäuser that has nothing to do actually with her per se in the story, but as you know, her husband died embarking for the crusade for Henry VI himself. So there is an enormously also tragic death, which is typically German and Germanic in a sense, in the worldview of the time. And this enormous empire that is wielded, that, however, creates this stark contrast through opposition and resentment and so on. The rider's white horse and peaceful demeanor surely can align with the aforementioned biblical imagery, and the statue's placement in a sacred space reinforces, for sure, its potential as an explicitly theological symbol that lives in any case in the statue. Alternatively, a recent theory suggests the rider as part of an unfinished Letna, that is to say, a quartz screen depicting the adoration of the Magi, with the rider representing one of the three wise men, his gaze directed towards the Star of Bethlehem. This hypothesis accounts for the statue's singular placement and lack of specific attributes, actually, and which would have been contextualized by a larger sculptural ensemble instead, possibly disrupted by political financial constraints during the cathedral's construction. Also, the darker hair could add to that. The Bamberger Reiter's iconographic distinctiveness lies in its departure from the dynamic, martial equestrian tradition of antiquity and its contemporaries, such as the Magdeburger Reiter or the Milanese statue of Oldrado da Treseno, dating to 1233. Indeed, the Bamberger Reiter adopts the standing horse motive seen in depictions of St. Martin's mantle sharing, as in the Lucchese sculpture of around 1233-1258. This motive, prevalent in 12th and 13th century manuscript illuminations, conveys humility, charity, and peace, aligning with the statue's serene composition. Literary influences further enrich its cultural context. For example, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Wilhelm, composed around 1212-1218, portrays an intimate bond between knight and horse, reflecting the chivalric ideals of the period and actually the millinery tradition of Indo-European equestrian tradition, while the Alexander romances widely circulated in Hohenstaufen courts glorify, again, Bucephalus as a symbol of heroic companionship. The bond between the horse and the horseman is the hallmark also of strict military effectiveness of cavalry that, let's stress it at this point, reached its peak in the Middle Ages and in the art of war, at least in the sanitary world. So really meant for these rulers something much greater, right? They were really very skilled horsemen. Frederick would use properly that to crush many enemies. He even disemboweled a Sicilian Islamic rebel in front of all his followers, by the way, that turned into the incredibly fateful Islamic Guard of Frederick II in the military colony of Lucera, where they were deported in northern Apulia in a very strategic position. It's still the castle and everything. So this idea of, again, transfiguring the also the barbarian, the infidel, the pact with al-Kamil, Sultan of Egypt, to recover Jerusalem, all this sort of ambiguity that is typical in an iconographical and ethnocultural sense at Frederick's court is incredibly powerful, incredibly potent, and properly incarnates the truly Catholic meaning of an imperial universal order. Because everything basically turns, as properly in the word universus, towards a single purpose, which is the Holy Roman Empire and the emperor who literally embodies. Frederick II's association with his horse Draco, again gifted by the Egyptian Sultan, and his court's engagement with these narratives suggests a possible literary inspiration for the statue's design, blending historical and mythical elements. The idea of riding a dragon, and so taming that obscure force to transfigure it in a resplendent fashion, is exactly what it is perhaps literally indicated here. Frederick II's documented hippophilia, so literally a philippia, evidenced by his diplomatic exchanges of horses, such as those with al-Kamil, but also King John of England, for example. It was his contemporary. They also looked similar, telling the truth. His patronage of equestrian treatises like the Hippiatria mentioned before, and his personal feats of horsemanship, including taming wild horses, strengthens Frederick's identification with the rider. All right. The statue's depiction of a Zelter, that is properly a horse reserved for elite riders in courtly and ceremonial contexts, aligns with Frederick's public persona as a ruler who wielded soft power through diplomacy and spectacle. However, the statue's sacred context poses a challenge, as non-canonized figures were rarely depicted in such spaces. Leave aside that Frederick was also excommunicated for a long time during these years, but there is some sort of greater perplexity regarding why the emperor in the church like that. Like precedents like the Aachen shrine of Charlemagne, which includes secular rulers to signify the Sacrum Imperium, suggests that the Bamberger Reiter could embody a concept of Amtsheiligkeit, sanctity of office, particularly under the patronage of Bishop Eckbert, whose loyalty to the Hohenstaufen cause was unwavering despite the aforementioned political upheavals. However, it is true that Charlemagne's shrine was something a bit more, like the Saint Frederick Barbarossa had, as you know, richly endowed and adorned it. So Charlemagne acted as a foundational, almost mythical and literally saintly figure by standards at this point the Hohenstaufen could sort of aspire to, but that weren't historically the same thing. In Charlemagne's time, also, the Frankish emperor was something truly beyond, was something much less normalized, especially by canonic rule, and especially north of the Alps could really aspire to that historical sanctity in life that was just expressed by his blood and accomplishments. In the case of Charlemagne, it would really sort of beyond proportion. So with Charlemagne is something much more complex. This statue's creation finally also reflects the broader artistic and intellectual currents of the Hohenstaufen era. The Bamberg Cathedral's sculptural program, including the Fürstenportal, the Doppelgrab, and other figures like the Ecclesia and Synagogue, was designed to project a unified vision of imperial and ecclesiastical authority, within which, in this sense, we could frame even Frederick II's presence, figure. The ecclesiastical policy in Germany at this point was quite delicate, but through loyal prelates you could achieve this massive feat, again, in a cathedral that was historically very tied to the same imperial ideology. The Reiter, likely executed by a workshop versed in French Gothic influences, evident in the fluid drapery and naturalistic details that are very sophisticated, very, very accurate, but also local Franconian traditions, demonstrates a mastery of stone carving and polychromy. The use of the Schilf-Sandstein, a regional sandstone, allowed for fine detailing, while the original polychromy created a dazzling effect, integrating the statue into the cathedral's liturgical environment. Like in the Ile-de-France, you have local resources serving, right, the spread also of these architectural styles, particular quarries might like allowed for very specific stone that is very that costs, by the way, a lot to transport. I made a video about construction materials of this era, and of course having the caves nearby was an incredible luck and fortune to finance these enormous projects that cost, in any case, an enormous lot, and just like the imperial purse here could afford. To the great, of course, favor of the local church. It was growing enormously powerful. It made really lots of videos explaining German princes and bishops' relations, how sort of tormented the whole situation really was, and how increasingly feudal and private this also was going, especially under Frederick's reign, especially after 1237, as a matter of fact, with the Edictum in Favorem Principum, that basically starts selling public authority, the imperial monarchy, to create some sort of dynastic private possession anyway. And this was a clientary mechanism through cooptation. We've seen it with Egbert and Frederick. Now, the Bamberger Reiter's survival through political upheavals, including the same fall of the Hohenstaufen dynasty after Frederick II's death in 1250, and Bishop Heinrich von Bilfersheim's defection to the papal cause in 1245, very delicate moment when Frederick was still alive, underscores the Bamberger Reiter's enduring significance as a testament to the local church's role as a spiritual and political center of Germany. The Bamberger Reiter's creation was likely a collaborative effort involving ecclesiastical and secular patrons, with Bishop Egbert playing a central role anyway, as the official of the local church. His ties to the Hohenstaufen, his Hungarian connections, and his personal history of exile and loyalty shaped the statue's conception, whether as a tribute to the current emperor, a memorial to Philip of Swabia, or a celebration of the Magyar monarch. We have, in this sense, an enormous legacy that lives in the statue that will keep influencing, in fact, other statues, not just in Germany, but in the rest of Europe, and at the same time, a prehistory as well, and or especially a rich iconography and sculptural production exactly in this era in different parts of Europe, and especially, again, Germany, Italy, so the Holy Roman Empire, and some of the most advanced, in fact, also artistic centers of Europe, to represent the peak of feudal power, even in areas where feudal power wasn't quite actually there per se, but equestrian, for example, was there. Knightly culture in its grandeur was being celebrated and imitated also by those who did not really stem from that nobiliar background, like in other parts, in other institutions, and so on. So there is an enormous work behind this, an enormous symbolism. It would be naturally interesting to come back on this work and to appreciate it, of course, in a deeper perspective fashion, because that's the only way you can really contextualize the meaning of it all, the symbolism, how resonant it was really at the time. And I was seeing here how many videos I made about Frederick II. I have an entire playlist dedicated to him, and I think we made around 10 videos, 12 or something. This is the number, in fact, 12. We recently made a video about his siege of Rome and so on, and there is this splendid background to that, and this monarch is the only one I dedicated so much videos for the Middle Ages. The other would be Augustus, and there's definitely an Augustan title connected to Frederick that represented himself as as a properly a Roman emperor. And there is a very, in fact, aside from the equestrian statue here, it is quite unique and characteristics of this renewed confidence and providential control over the world. There is a plethora of actual statues of imperial rulers that really inspire themselves to Roman statues, Roman art. And sometimes we don't know whether it's Frederick II or Henry VII. Difficult it is to reconstruct this in an era in which, in fact, the knightly dimension was not so contemplative and sort of modernized as we think it, especially in Germany. That's what we don't sometimes understand even properly in the fullest meaning of the Ghibelline tradition, that the opposition, for example, to the idea that the clergy was to be the first estate as opposed to the second was naturally like that a cosmical clash, but still integrated in the necessity of such traditional order in order to reaffirmation of something higher. So that's why as we're looking at these videos and think like that's really too few. Well, really, even though we talked about Frederick Strauss, all of Schwerpunkt's history, there is something beyond this that can't properly be grasped unless we get a bit more thoroughly into the actual depths of Frederick's times. We should make a bit more of German figures in the biographical series now, because again, there is an enormous lot to cover. We mentioned even Wolfram from Eschenbach. We talked about also some legions like the one of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. They all live in this big of a magical, enchanted fairy tale like reign of Frederick II that we shouldn't remember like this just for some artistic or literary reason. It doesn't matter how beautiful. Also, Wagner's real elaboration of the same is, or how just the same Bamberger Reiter for anyone who even doesn't know anything about him. Like just looking at him, you realize things that you understand the depth of the spiritual depth of the era, itself. But it is in fact something that went close to the establishment of a golden age, with that pinch of drama and a sense of, Age of the Wolf and Comet that is specific of the of the era, and of in particular the German view on this. And we really made lots of videos about medieval Germany, but again, it feels that it's such an enormous country that we haven't covered it adequately. Right here I see this is the 136th video about Germany. It's kind of too few, right? And we shall talk a bit more about the wall, because it's exactly this mix between the modernity and tradition in a time and a space that is really central in the history of Europe, and that therefore culminates even artistically with this enormous masterpieces. And I think really have to make many videos before reaching that sort of satisfactory level, at least of documentation, right? I'm trying my best here. It's very difficult actually to choose new topics, not because I lack them, I don't know how to make videos on them, but exactly because there are so many that sometimes you get carried away by this current, this date, it's other, I want to do this, I want to do that, and you don't have sort of the bigger picture under control, which is also what, however, is sort of happening gradually, is being achieved through this relentless videos output. And I'm glad, of course, to see new subscribers, the general support you display for the channel. Let's make this all more intense, right? I think we can really reach very satisfactory results at some point. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.